Okay, this is Bible Lesson 7. I had meant to just record it on my computer, upload it later. But as it turns out, unbeknownst to me, my microphone sometimes cuts out, and I don't know it till the end. So I spent a couple hours this morning yakking about the Bible, and half of it's there, half of it isn't. And so I decided I will just do a hangout and see if anybody comes along, and they can tell me if my mic is cutting out. So hopefully somebody will come along, and I think we have at least one person who might, and they can let me know if I'm not being heard or pages are not being seen. I'm going to share my screen here. That was another problem I had. My recording software did not record the window I thought it was recording. So it was going to be a royal pain to try to redo it, and I decided if I'm going to redo it, I might as well do it this way and at least get some feedback on how the audio and video are working. Also, if I had just made the images, put them in later with editing software, you wouldn't see me scrolling the pages and everything. So welcome, Vic. Thanks for coming, and we'll get started here. And hopefully I won't go another full 2 hours like I went this morning, but we'll see. All right. Mostly I'm just going to look at the first 3 chapters of Genesis, a little bit of chapter 4, just to prove a point about the serpent seed theory. And we'll just dive right in here and take a look. I'm using primarily the Net Bible, New English translation, primarily because it has very good footnotes that you can hopefully see on the side here. And I'm not sure always that my cursor matches where I think it is on the screen. So if I'm not pointing where it looks like I should be, then I'll try to highlight things, for example, like this, because I never know where my cursor is going to be. So let's get going here. For some reason, it's gone up a few verses, and I didn't want it to do that. Okay, here we go. Verse 1. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And sorry about my throat clearing in advance. I'm getting over a cold. Tried to drink some tea and get rid of that, but I'll do the best I can. It's talking in the footnotes about how this is a narrative sequence, and this is how it would begin in those days in ancient Near East. And of course, God himself has no beginning or end, but his creation has a beginning. So it's talking about the beginning of creation, not the beginning of God or anything like that. So he created, this is kind of a title or intro. He created the heavens, the earth. The next verse does not say the next thing he did, like as if what's called the gap theory happened and some disaster befell the earth and then he had to recreate it because it was formless and void, as the King James puts it. Here it says without shape and empty. But that's not supportable if according to any majority of scholars that study the ancient languages and their habits and literary devices. And so there is no support that I can see for the gap theory. So this is just an intro statement, and this is what's going to be talked about. And later on at the end of this section, actually a little bit into chapter 2, it will be kind of a summary. This is the end of the narrative, and then after that begins a more detailed description, which is not a second creation in my opinion. Okay, so verse 2, the earth was without shape and empty, and darkness was over the surface of the watery deep, but the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the water. So this matches the New Testament. I think it's in 2 Peter, where it says the world was made out of water and by water. So God began creating by making water. And this is also supported by scientific statements that seem to indicate that that space and what is called space and everything we find in it has something to do with water. Let me just type something in the chat here. Okay, now And God said, and we know that vibrations are responsible for a lot of things. It was attributed to Tesla to say that if you want to understand the universe, think in terms of energy, frequency, and vibration. And so speaking is emitting a vibration or wave pattern of some sort. And though we're given the words, the thing that God said, we're given it in human language, and who knows what the actual vibration that God spoke was, but it had creative power, and that's how God made things. And it doesn't say that about making the water, it just says he made it, and then God said, okay, and the first thing he said was, let there be light. This does not mean the sun was created then. It doesn't say anything about the sun. It just said he created something called light. And going into verse 4, he made a difference between light and darkness. Verse 5, he called the light day and the darkness night. There was evening and there was morning the first day. And you'll see this pattern throughout creation week. There, evening and morning, day 1, evening and morning, day 2. When you combine evening and morning and a day number like that, it seems pretty obvious that they're talking about a very specific sequence of solar days. So these are not epochs or ages or anything like that. It's difficult to imagine how they could have expressed literal solar days any more clearly. If someone knows of a way, let me know, but I have not heard of any such thing. So evening and morning, day 1 is very specific. And even though, once this again, the sun was not there, God had made light and separated it from darkness, and that's how days and nights were determined. And the fact that he mentions night and then day is where the Hebrews get the idea that a day begins at sunset. And so anytime you read about days in the Bible, you have to be careful whether the context tells you it's a 24-hour period of starting with sunset to the next sunset, or the actual daylight hours. You have to just pay attention to that in the context. All right, so first there was water, and then light and darkness, and then the next day, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, and let it separate water from water. So God made the expanse and separated the water under it from the water above it, and he called the expanse sky, evening and morning, day 2. So whatever the expanse is, there's water above it as well as below it. And we know from the text here that the water below is the seas and oceans. And the water above cannot be the atmosphere or water in the atmosphere, because there are waters above that. And we'll see later what all is contained in the expanse, also called the firmament. That comes from the Latin. Firmamentum means something hard or solid. It means a foundation, and these are similar to Greek and Hebrew words. It's a foundation or framework. And we'll look at the molten glass theory here for a little bit before I go on. By the way, there's the Nets Bible. I think I'm sharing this. I'm not sure. Yes, I think I am. Oh, there it goes. It's just delayed. Sorry. Then right now I want to look at the Hebrew word for the expanse, which is rakia. Various translations. These are not attempts to hide anything. They're just what the translators honestly thought it meant. If there is an agenda, someone would have to prove that such an agenda exists. It could be. I believe I've seen agendas in other parts of Scripture, so it's possible. But as far as proof goes, you'd have to prove that they had some nefarious purpose in all of this. So at any rate, there are different ways to translate the word, but it all means pretty much the same thing. As some of the text here shows, some believe that the rakia was a rock-solid object and formed a dome over the earth. According to ancient Near East, that's what ANE stands for in this context, ancient Near East mythological viewpoint. Some, like this Mr. Seeley, I assume Mr. was of the opinion that this was a solid dome, something you could knock on, that kind of solid. And that this was the common belief at the time. So you can go on and read that. This is let's see, I think I have this link in the description. I'm not sure if I do or not. But at any rate, you can see it as theopedia.com/Raquia, RAQIYA. So they go on to explain why they believe this, and there's an opposing view by someone called Beale that, quote, "We just do not know that all ancients believed the sky was a solid dome, or that there was anything near unanimity on this point." So it's debatable whether they believe the ancients held that the firmament or expanse was a solid thing. At any rate, it's holding the waters up. We can at least say that. And we have to understand also that something like a force field could serve the same purpose and be just as impassable as something solid. It may just be a force of some kind. So there's that, the Hebrew word. We also have the Greek equivalent, because there was a Greek New Testament, the Septuagint, as I mentioned before in an earlier video, stereoma. And it is also a solid body, or foundation or framework or skeleton of something, and used also of a ship, like the framework of a ship. So we have the general idea that the vault or expanse or firmament is definitely a force of some kind, whether that force is in the form of a solid object that holds something up or some kind of field. Here's an article also on the skies hard as a molten mirror, as per Job 37:18. And you might want to read that, HebrewCosmology.com. And you can see the title here. I should put that in the chat because, well, no, that won't do any good. I'll have to put it in the description because the chat will disappear later. At any rate, that when it comes to passages like that, Job is written very poetically. Now, it's also a history. There's not a whole lot of difference between the two when you look at ancient documents like this. They wrote their history in story form, not to hide anything or change the facts, but because that's how you would remember history. It was oral history at first, and so people were in the habit of saying history in such a way that it would be easy to remember and not be the cold, clinical way that modern historians would record things, just recording facts and times and things like that. They were not as concerned with the minute of the day as they were with the basic facts of something, and not as much about chronology necessarily. So the problem comes when we have no way at all of telling whether something is strictly poetic or not, or whether it's actually telling us something. And an allegory always points to a reality. So an allegory is not just a fictional story. It isn't fictional at all. Its purpose is to explain some real thing. So here in Job, we have the account of this person named Job who had certain things happen to him, and toward the end of the book, God speaks to him and asks him a bunch of rhetorical questions because Job had been demanding an audience with God for his suffering, and God answers him by telling of things that God can do that Job cannot, to emphasize the difference between the two, and that Job, as a mere human, really didn't have any room to talk or point fingers at God. So that's the passage in the context of the discussion of the sky as a solid vault. So we have to ask ourselves, first of all, whether God is simply using poetic expression to describe real things or not. But here's the point, is that in the Bible, you will never see or hear God or anyone describe the earth in anything but terms of a solid, non-moving object, with above and below, north and south. It is never described as moving. The earth is never described as moving. The sun is always described as moving around the earth in some way, whether around a sphere or around a circle, above a circle and spiraling around it. The same for the moon and the stars. So it's an argument from silence to say that every time the Bible talks about the structure of the earth or the universe, that it must be poetic. And yet it describes a reality of some sort. So it seems to me that it's more reasonable from the context of the Bible to take this as God giving an indication of the immovable earth as anything else. But once again, I will try to put all these links in the description and try not to forget that before I move on. Let me go back here to Genesis now that we've talked about the expanse. And remember that there are waters above it. However, they're held up, I should say. God called the expanse sky, evening and morning, a second day. Now, the third day starts on verse 9 here. God said, let the water under the sky be gathered to one place, and let dry ground appear. And it was so. God called the dry ground land, and the gathered waters he called seas. And then he says on that same day in verse 11, let the land produce vegetation, and plants yielding seeds according to their kinds, trees with fruit. It was so, and God saw that that was good, evening and morning, the third day. Here we have answered the question, which came first, the chicken or the egg? God creates things as mature, grown things, whether we're talking about plants or animals or people. They're all created in their mature form and given the ability to reproduce. So the chicken comes first. There you go. Now, then after he produced the vegetation, then the fourth day begins down in verse 14. And he says, let there be lights in the expanse, in it, of the sky to separate the day from the night, and let them be signs to indicate seasons, days, and years, and let them serve as lights in the expanse of the sky to give light on the earth. So here we have the location of the lights or luminaries, excuse me, and their purpose. The location is in the firmament, in the expanse, in it. Not above it, not below it, in it. Okay? And their purpose is to serve as a calendar and a clock and to put light on the earth. So we know what it is, where it is, and its purpose. He made two great lights, the greater light, the sun, of course, ruling over the day, the lesser light, the moon, ruling over the night, and he made the stars. That seems like such an afterthought. He made the stars also, but it's only an afterthought if you believe that stars are unimaginably huge and unbelievably far away. And if you see lights in the sky, you don't know neither their size nor their distance, you can't guess which is which. You have to have one of those to know the other. If the stars are huge, they must be far away. If they're small, they must be near. We don't know. So in the Bible, with this so-called afterthought, he made the stars also, kind of leans us toward the idea that the stars are small and near. Okay? Otherwise, you would think that the vastness of space, as we have been told, is rather obvious, a glaring omission in the text here, as if God didn't care. I mean, when we read the whole Bible, we know that man and earth, man is the purpose of God's creation. Earth was made for man, and the luminaries were made for earth. So we're the center of it all, and to have that overall context plus the specific one was tell us that the stars are small and near. This also fits in with later prophecies in Revelation when the stars fall to earth. Okay, so we look at the context first, and science will catch up someday. That's all I know. So we know the purpose of the lights, and that that light existed itself very early in the creation week, and only later was were the luminaries created for these specific purposes. Then on the fifth day, God makes the living sea creatures, And here's an interesting statement: let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. It doesn't say they're in the sky necessarily. It doesn't matter whether you read the Greek or the Hebrew. It says they're flying across the surface, basically. So it could be, and I'm speculating, but I'm trying to get clues from the text here, that the birds, the sky, the atmosphere of breathable air, you might say, is kind of a buffer zone between the surface of the earth and the vault of the sky. Sky can be all-inclusive to all of those things, but in this case, it's saying that where the birds fly, where the clouds are and all that, is something, an area where they fly across the expanse, not in it. Whether that's a big deal or not, I don't know, but I'm just pointing out that this is the way it's worded, and that it may be a difference between that and the actual vault or expanse itself. Okay, then in verse 21, it goes on to say God created the sea creatures and everything in them. And he told everything to be fruitful and multiply, fill the water in the seas, let the birds multiply on the earth. And that was the fifth day. So these things are all living, moving things, and we're going to see that he treats these differently than he does the green plants. Plants are only called green. They're never called living, and they're never said to have the breath of life in them. And the Net Bible here, the notes go on to argue that the breath of life in the animals is not exactly the same word or concept as the breath and life in humans. That this breath of life has the connotation of spirit and soul, and that this is connected with us being made in God's image, and we'll come to that in a minute. At any rate, the living things that move and swim and fly are not considered the same as green plants just because they reproduce and grow. So the Bible would say that alive is defined not just by whether it moves or grows, because even rocks can be said to do that. They can grow and shift form and build up and all that, and crystals can grow seemingly, but these are not considered alive by anything I can see in the Bible. And so then this finishes the fifth day, and God says, this is starting the sixth day now. God says, let the land produce. That's an interesting statement. Let the land produce living creatures according to their kinds, cattle, creeping things, wild animals. And it was so. And then he said that that was good. And that was the first thing he did on day 6. Okay, so he created fish before animals. And if you're paying attention to the order, this does not match evolutionary theory at all. Okay, especially with the plants coming, at a different time than the sea creatures, coming in a different time than the land animals, and none of them say they came from the other. They're all according to their kinds. So then, after all that, the very last, God says, let us make humankind in our image after our likeness. Some argue that this is simply the way that people at that time reference deity, always in the plural form, as a kind of honorary plural, I think it's called. Others say that this is an instance of the Trinity. Some say he was talking to the angels, but the angels are never, ever portrayed as creators in the Bible. Not once. So I think we can rule out the angels, although it's from the various other parts of the Bible, we can deduce that the angels were created before God created humans. Whether they were created for anything else, I think they were, because in Job, once again, God says that the angels shouted for joy and clapped their hands and all that when God created things. So although that isn't stated, we can, I think, safely say that the angels were created before God made anything else. And it's probably, here again speculating, that the creation of man is what led to Satan's jealousy. Satan, of course, was originally created as the highest archangel. I'm not going to go look those up right now. Arch meaning chief in that kind of context. He was the greatest created being, and evidently in charge of the music, and that eventually sin was found in him. It says that he wanted God's position as the highest, most worshipped being, and so he rebelled, and a third of the other created beings, the angels, went and followed him. And so right now, though, that part is not stated here as part of the creation narrative for some reason. Now, so God makes man in his image. And he says mankind, we hear the word in Hebrew is Adam. Adam was originally the name of human. You could say the human to say Adam at that time. Later, it eventually becomes the name of the male. But right now, in this context, at this point in creation, it means mankind. Because we have the plural here for they may rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air and over the cattle and all the earth and everything that moves on the earth. Mankind, not just Adam, but mankind was given dominion over the entire earth. Not to ruin it, but to take care of it. And then verse 27, God says he created mankind in his own image, in his own likeness. Created male and female in his likeness, okay? So some would argue that only the male was made in the image of God. That's completely false. Both of them were made in the image of God. And you have to remember that this is the overview. In chapter 2, we'll get into the details. But this is the overview generally telling us evening and morning for 6 days what God did on each day, okay? Now, we also see that God blessed them and said to them, be fruitful and multiply, fill the earth and subdue it, rule over everything. And then he says in verse 29, I now give you every seed-bearing plant on the face of the entire earth and every tree that has fruit with seed in it for food. Okay, so people were fruitarians. And the same goes for the animals in verse 30. It says the animals, the birds, everything that moves on the ground that has the breath of life in it, I give every green plant for food. He's not talking about fish here, but he is talking about people and land animals and birds all being eating green plants for food. And the green plants, once again, are called green, not living things. They're just called green and they reproduce. And so they were to serve as food for all the things with the breath of life in them. So that was the 6th day. And now here we have, starting in chapter 2, the first few verses is the summary. We had an intro, now we're having a summary. The heavens and earth were completed with everything that was in them. By the 7th day, God finished the work that he'd been doing, and he ceased on the 7th day all that work, and he blessed it and made it holy because he stopped working and stopped creating. Now, that doesn't mean God never did anything else, because even Jesus said, my Father is still working and I'm working. So people who want to try to make a federal case out of God never doing anything else after the 6th day will have to contend with those passages. But the footnote on making it holy here on the right side of the screen, I hope you can see, is that God sanctified it or set it apart and distinguished it. On a literal level, they say the phrase means that God made the day different. But in the context of the law, it would mean that the day belonged to God and was for rest. So the law hadn't been given here. So we are out of the context of the law and therefore out of the meaning of it being a holy day of rest. Okay, all it's saying here is that God stopped working then. So this day was different from all that had come before it. Okay, that's all that's being said here. So people who want to say that everyone for all time was supposed to honor the Sabbath by not working are taking it out of context and cherry picking. Okay, so now we know we have our summary of the creation week. And now in verse 4, it's going to go back and give a detailed description of what it had just described. Okay. This is not a second creation, and that would be in ignorance of the writing styles of people of Moses' time. And so, because Moses wrote it down later, doesn't mean that he was there when this happened. It means Moses wrote it down, and it was evidently taught by God. He also learned and was undoubtedly influenced by Egyptian training as well. But Moses being a prophet of God, he would not lie and say that God said this or that or spoke this or that, and when it wasn't true, and he was just doing Egyptian cosmology. So be careful about that. So now the recap and description says about that at first there was before there were any shrubs or plants on the earth, it was because God had not caused it to rain, and no one was there to cultivate the ground. So evidently, that was one of the purposes of mankind, as will be stated specifically about the Garden of Eden later on. But it did say the springs would well up. There was no rain falling, but springs or dew would come up from the ground and water it. And then God formed, in verse 7, God formed man from the soil of the ground and breathed into his nostrils the breath of life, and man became a living being. Okay, and this is where their footnote, where they distinguish what the meaning of the word soul, because sometimes soul refers to the entire person, the body and the spirit, and that's the normal meaning, and that a living being is used as both for animals and people. Okay, that's what they're saying in this footnote. But man was formed from the soil. Okay, now the soil earlier produced the animals as well. So here we have man being made from soil just like the animals were. Keep that in mind. Then, this is before Eden was created. He created Adam from soil that was not where the garden was. And then he planted an orchard in the east in Eden. And there he placed the man he had formed. He made all kinds of trees grow from the soil, every tree that was pleasing to look at and good for food. Now, the tree of life and the tree of the knowledge of good and evil were in the middle of the orchard. Now, that tree, normally people call it just the tree of knowledge, but that's not the name. It's the knowledge of good and evil. Okay? So this is the beginning of where people cut off the meaning and tell a half-truth and try to get this theory that God was trying to hide knowledge from people, and that the serpent was actually a good person trying to, not person in that sense of human, but a good sentient being trying to impart knowledge to man that God was hiding. That is an absolute twisting backwards of everything, and that is the beginning of Gnostic theology. Also, Dr. Michael Heiser, an expert in ancient Semitic languages and culture and religion, said he calls this the theology of the Watchers being the fallen angels. They want to turn everything upside down and make Satan the hero. And that's not what happened here. The tree of the knowledge of good and evil were in the middle of the orchard. And by knowledge, we conceive from what we're going to read in the context here is an experiencing and knowing by experiencing what evil was. Okay, and that's what God was telling them not to take, but he was not preventing them from taking it. It was a test, but the reason for the test is not to tempt people to sin and see if they'll fall, but to give them a true and genuine choice. You can't say, there was God right there in the garden, they could see him, and he had always been in charge, but in order to return his love, they would have to be able to choose not to return it. And so something had to be set up that would give them the opportunity to make that choice without causing them to make it and without being evil in itself. Okay, and this was next to the tree of life in the middle of this orchard. Now, in the next few verses, they go on to describe the river system and various minerals and gems and whatnot, which is an interesting topic of his own, but I'd rather not cover that right now. So in verse 15, God puts man in the Garden of Eden to care for it and maintain it. Now, In some text, it says to keep it, which means to guard it. The same word used there in the Septuagint, the Greek, also means to guard or protect in the New Testament Greek as well. So it's very possible, though has to be speculated, that there was more going on here than just tending the garden. There was also protecting its perimeter. It wasn't a limited space. It was not the entire earth. And so God puts Adam here. Right now, this is Adam and Eve, technically. This is both of them because he spoke to them as plural earlier, although the plurality, the separation had not yet taken place. But so at least the man is aware, the Adam is aware that he was made from dust and he was put in this garden for a purpose. Then he says to the Adam, as it says in the Hebrew, you can eat anything you want from these trees, but not from the tree of the knowledge of good and evil, because if you eat its fruit, you will die. Now, it goes on in these footnotes to explain, and I've can support this with other readings and studies, that dying does not physically, it's when you begin to die, it's mortality. People say that we begin to die as soon as we're born, but that's not true. Think of each cell's ability to replicate as like a string of beads, and every time it reproduces itself, you lose a bead. Okay, and the length of that string of beads is determining the length of your life, given optimum conditions. Other things can happen to shorten your life prematurely, but given a good environment, you will live out your lifespan determined by how many beads you have on the string that tells you how long you can reproduce your cells. And so what mortality is limiting a finite number of beads on that string. Okay, so that's what God is saying is going to happen if you eat of this tree. Your lifespan will be cut off. You will become mortal. Okay, that's what it meant to die. Now, dying is separation. Separating the spirit from the body is what death is. It also can be a figurative, well, actually, it's a literal separation, but intangible when the spirit of a person is separated from the spirit of God. That's a spiritual death. Spiritual death does not mean you become suddenly an evil thing. It just means that evil that you chose to do has separated you from God in some way. Okay. So he gives this order. Then God says it's not good for man to be alone. Adam doesn't say this. But as we'll see, God is going to, there's something about man that isn't right. Adam is not complaining about being alone, but he probably will, although it has to be inferred. So let's read on. God says, I will make a companion for him who corresponds to him. This in Hebrew is Ezer kenegdo. Ezer means helper. Kenegdo means someone corresponding, an equal partner, somebody who has your back. Okay? And this does not in any way infer that there is a hierarchy here, because many times God is called the Ezer, the helper of Israel, or various individuals. That certainly does not mean God is suddenly becoming inferior. When a parent helps a child, it does not mean that the child is superior all of a sudden, although there are some individuals who actually teach, in order to prop up male supremacy, they will teach that even God becomes inferior to man when he helps man in that instance. It's ridiculous. So, at any rate, Eve's creation was to be an equal corresponding to Adam. Not identical with Adam, but someone who supplied what he lacked, which is what God does for us. He supplies what we lack. It's the person who needs help who is lacking. And so Adam was lacking something. So God is going to create a companion for him. But before he does, in verse 19, he says that it describes how God formed every animal out of the field and every bird of the air and brought them to the man to see what he would name them. Now, some people, as a side note here, believe that this is a second creation of Adam's or a different order of the first creation. And because you can't really, from the language, justify saying God had formed. Be that as it may, the fact is that in this context, the emphasis is on the fact that God brings all these creatures to Adam to be named. Does this mean, is this why Adam's in charge? Because he named the animals? No. They Adam and Eve, where all mankind were put in charge of the animals. So this is not an act of authority. This is simply God bringing the animals to Adam to be named. And of course, he didn't name every subspecies that would ever exist. He named the basic kinds. So it says he named the animals, the birds of the air, the living creatures of the field. But for Adam, verse 20, no companion who corresponded to him was found, even though they were all made from the dust. He was made from dust. The animals were made from dust, but they were not equal to him. So verse 21, God caused the man to fall into a deep sleep, and while he was asleep, he took part of the man's side and closed up the place with flesh. Side, some people say, no, it must mean rib. Others say, well, see, it includes flesh with it, not just bone. So the footnotes here argue for it meaning side, and you can't be any really more specific than that. And that, by the way, this idea of putting a person into a deep sleep before doing surgery is where early surgeons got the idea of anesthesia. So anyway, God puts Adam to sleep and takes part of him, closes it up with flesh, and then makes a woman from the part he takes out of the man and brings her to the man. Okay, so she is not made directly from the dust. Whether it's indirect or not is really not important in this context to this narrative. And so logically, God, to argue that, well, yeah, she really was made from the dust. No, not according to what God is emphasizing here. He's saying she was made from him. He alone was made from the dust like the animals. So he makes a part, and then look at what Adam says. This one at last is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. She will be called woman because she was taken out of man. Now in the Hebrew, these words for woman and man is ish and woman is isha. Okay, and man was never called ish until this separation happened. Okay, he was encompassing everyone and was called Adam, which means is taken from the word for red, and the soil was evidently reddish. But now the man, the Adam says, or the ish says, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh. Look what he's saying. He's not saying, wow, this is different. He's saying, wow, this is exactly the same. This is one like me, a companion's corresponding. This is what God was showing that Adam he did not have among the animal kingdom. This was one on his level. This was his clone. Eve was not made inferior. How could she be? She was made of the same stuff as Adam. But she was not made directly from the dust. So even though the animals were made from the dust like Adam was, Adam had authority over them. But he did not have authority over Eve. She was not made from the dust, and God granted all of them, all humankind, authority over the creation. So she's called what she is because she was taken out of man. So man is missing something. Woman is what he's missing. Does not mean they're identical as far as they are male and female, a definite difference, so they can procreate, but they are both equally human. One does not rule over the other. Okay, and now this is the phrase "that is why" in verse 24 is an indication of an editorial comment by the person writing, which was Moses, who says, you see this, what God just said here about creation? This is why a man leaves his father and mother and unites with his wife, and they become a new family, or one flesh. Let's look at the footnote here on one flesh. That's the literal meaning, and they describe in grammatical terms what's going on here. Because the word doesn't mean just a sexual union, it means a union of people and maybe groups of people. It's a rejoining of that which was formerly separate. And it's a joining in every sense of the word and not just physical. So this is a unifying, a reconnection, you could say. And notice also that it says, even in the patriarchal society, it says the man leaves his parents and unites to his wife. He joins to her. I'm absolutely certain that if it had said that she joins to him, that this would be offered as further proof that she is inferior. But instead, it's said the other way. And of course, I've been arguing all along that this is not about hierarchy at all. And but if anybody wanted to say something about hierarchy by, who came first, who was named first, we have to remember that everything in creation preceded Adam. So if he was inferior for being last, then if that's how inferiority is determined, then he would be the not ruling over creation. And yet Eve was created even more laster than him, and she is said to be inferior for that reason. So this is a logical fallacy called special pleading, where you see a pattern and then a break to that pattern, and so you make an exception, a special pleading, a special case for that. And so they say, well, Adam is in charge because he was last, but he's also in charge because he was first. It's a silly, self-contradictory argument. At any rate, Eve was last, and he joins to her to form a new union, a new family. All right. Now, some people add, this is the end of chapter 2, and there is an actual break here, regardless of the chapters and verses not being added till later. But the text itself tells us there's a break here. Now, we have that now again, just as we did earlier when early in chapter 2. Now the serpent was more shrewd than any of the wild animals that God had made. So we had a break here that there was creation. Here's man and woman. And now something's going to go wrong. Okay, nothing was wrong before that. There was no hierarchy. There was no lusting. There was no hint of what I call Genesis 2.5 that people add, where Eve gets the idea that she's upset because she's inferior, and so she goes plotting and scheming behind his back. That's not what happens at all, not hinted anywhere in the Bible. So here we are at the original story of creation, and we'll see that there is no such tale between those two chapters. So now the emphasis is on the fall of man, and here we have the serpent, and that it was more shrewd or cunning than all the animals. Maybe we could say more intelligent. Now, as far as speaking to the woman, there's various theories that all the animals could speak at that time, or that this animal was being operated like a puppet by Satan. And I don't care whether you use Lucifer or Satan, whatever the name is, this is the same being. And we have other passages, such as in Revelation, that equates Satan with the serpent, the dragon. All of these things are referring to the same being. At any rate, the serpent says, or it also means shining one, you can take that however you want, says to the woman, is it really true? So he's planting doubt in Eve's mind. Now, why is he talking to the woman? Every theory about that is speculation. The popular one is because there was something wrong with her. She was gullible. She was weak. She was stupid, whatever. But God did not make a gullible, weak, stupid companion for Adam. He made an equal corresponding to him, someone who was his companion to supply what he lacked. So why, not only was she not inferior to Adam, but why was she targeted instead of Adam? She was the last one created, remember? She was the one who never saw God create anything. Adam saw God create. He knew that Eve did not exist before, and he went to sleep and woke up, and there she was. God had created her. So Adam knew firsthand that God was the creator, but Eve did not. She had no such experience, and lack of experience can make you gullible and naive. And both of them were in a state of innocence at that time. They had no knowledge of good and evil. They were neutral. They were innocent. They had no idea of such things. And so it was easy to be fooled. But if you're going to fool somebody and make it epic, you increase your chances by picking the one most likely to be fooled, not because of a defect, but because of lack of experience. So he goes after the woman and says, and plants doubt in her mind, said, is it really true that God said not to eat from any of the trees? Of course, he's changing also the command. God said not to eat, but he didn't say you couldn't eat anything. But that's how Satan puts it, the serpent puts it. And Eve corrects him. She says, we can eat of the fruit of any of the trees in the orchard except those two, or that one in the middle, that God said don't eat of it and don't touch it or you'll die. Now, some people say that because she added don't touch it, that she either A, changed the story, B, got it from Adam and Adam changed the story, or C, was simply mistaken. But nowhere in the Bible ever hints that Eve misunderstood or got her story from Adam or anything like that. What this is, we're in a context of a detailed retelling of the creation week. And so we can safely assume that she got this directly from God. And this is a more complete statement than we were told in the first chapter, in the first telling, the overview. So God said not to eat it, not to touch it. Okay. And then we've already talked about what it means to die. So now the serpent says, you won't die. Okay. So he's calling God a liar. And he's putting a motive into God's mind. For God knows that when you eat from it, your eyes will open and you will be like divine beings who know good and evil. Okay, so he's telling her, first of all, making her question God's motives. Then he's making her question God's uniqueness. And then he's saying, here's a lure, here's something tempting for you to consider, that you can be like him. He didn't tempt Adam with that because Adam knew better. Now in verse 6, when she saw that the tree produced fruit that was good for food and all this, and to make her wise, she took it and ate it. Now listen, she gave also some of it to her husband who was with her, and he ate it. He was right there. He heard the whole thing. Later we'll see God chastise Adam for listening to the voice of his wife. Now, this particular version will put it that he obeyed her. Now, even these people know better, and they put all the evidence against them in their own commentary here in the footnotes. But the fact is that he heard the conversation with the serpent, and he said nothing, he did nothing, he did not intervene, he just stood there. And then when she offered the fruit to him, he just took it and ate it. We could speculate that he ate it because he saw that Eve did not immediately drop dead. So he thought, what the heck, I'll eat it too. But the fact is that she had to be tricked to be enticed to sin. Adam did not have to be tricked. He was not tricked. So he sinned with his eyes wide open. Now, here's where God comes into the picture. And I want to explain a certain rhetorical device before we go on. There's something called a chiasm. It's based on the Greek letter chi, which is an X, shaped like an X. And it's a good illustration of arguing from general points down to a specific point, and then back again in reverse order. It's like a mirror image. And you know where the point is, the crux of the argument is, by looking at where the pivot starts, where you see these steps leading up to something, and then you see the steps going back down. And so that central point where the cross is between the two lines, that's the crux of the whole point going on. And that's what we're seeing here in the order in which God confronts people, or the three entities involved here, Adam, Eve, and the serpent. And it has nothing to do with Adam being in charge. Otherwise, if Adam was in charge of Eve, he would never have confronted Eve at all. He'd have had Adam do it. Okay? The fact is that Adam, Eve, and the serpent were each held responsible. And when you have a responsibility for yourself, you have authority. So this is not a hierarchy, once again. So once this happened, God starts coming toward them, and they hear him, whatever's involved in that, and they hid from him. And God called to the man and said to him, where are you? God, of course, knew. It's just like a parent saying to a child, where are you? They know very well where they are, but they want the child to say. And the man replied, I heard you moving about in the orchard, and I was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. And God said, who told you you were naked? So God has confronted the man. And he goes on to say, did you eat from that tree I told you not to eat from? And then the man says, that woman you gave me. So he's passing blame, and he doesn't even mention the serpent. He says, the woman you gave me, she gave me some fruit from the tree and I ate it. So he's blaming God for making the woman who gave him the fruit. Okay, this is where things escalated, because just eating the fruit made them mortal. I mean, it happened to Eve too. She ate the fruit and she became mortal. So did Adam. But Adam is escalating his sin by blaming God for making the woman. Okay? He was all happy about her at first. He finally found a companion, and what does he do? He throws her under the bus. So then God turns to the woman and says, what did you do? And she tells the truth. the serpent tricked me and I ate. She didn't try to deny that she ate. She mentioned the serpent, which Adam failed to do. She said, I was tricked. The serpent tricked me and I ate. Now, God then turns to the serpent. And the first thing he says is, because you have done this. We're going to see that he says this also to Adam, but he does not say it to Eve. Because you have done this. Okay? Now, to the serpent. Because you have done this, cursed are you above all the wild beasts. On your belly you will crawl, dust you will eat all the days of your life. And then in verse 15, I will put hostility, traditionally enmity, but it's hostility. It's like war between you and the woman. Okay, so first of all, between Satan and Eve and women, there is this war. We can see this in history, how Satan really hates women. And God put that hatred there between them. Okay? And this is how he's going to do it, by promising something, a blessing of mankind to rescue them from sin, from Satan's trickery, through the woman, through the seed of the woman. That's how God puts the hatred between. He didn't suddenly make Satan do something he didn't want to do. He says, I'm going to put a war between the two of you, between you and womankind, by making her the true helper that Adam needed. She is going to be the true Ezer Kenegdo that I created her to be, by getting you out of this jam, and that this is really seriously what's going to cause the rift between them. Okay, this is how God is going to do it. And between your offspring and her offspring. What does that mean? Well, now we're getting into this ridiculous serpent seed theory. And we're going to see more about that later. I think, let's see, I don't have that up in a tab here, sorry, but I'll get to that. There's a verse, let me find my notes here on this. I evidently closed that window and I didn't mean to. I think it's in 1 John. Wait, I do have that. Hold on a second. I do have that. I knew I had it somewhere. 1 John 3:12. We must not be like Cain, Cain and Abel are the children of Adam and Eve. Or the serpent seed theory says, no, we must not be like Cain, who followed the evil one and murders his brother. It says Cain, if you look in the Greek here, Cain out of the evil one was. They think that means the serpent seed. That was easy for me to say, right? Wasn't it? Anyway, that's where the serpent seed theory comes from. But we're going to see in chapter 4 that that's not true at all. We have a very clear refutation of that idea. At any rate, right here in Genesis 3:15, God says that her offspring will attack your head and you will attack her offspring's heel. Now, the footnotes here are arguing that this is all about women and snakes, or people and snakes. But we all know that not all women are afraid of snakes. Not all men are not afraid of snakes. And so there's a lot more going on here than the fact that snakes strike at your heel. There, in this context, we're seeing that this is a context of judgment against the serpent, against Satan, and that there's a rift between Satan and women, and because she's going to be the helper of man that he had just caused the downfall of, and that many take this as the first prophecy of the Messiah, who would be the seed of the woman in the most literal sense, because he would be born of a virgin. So God has judged the serpent and condemned him because you have done this. Now in verse 16, to the woman God says, and he does not say, because you have done this. She ate the fruit, but she was tricked. Now this next part says, I will greatly increase your labor pains. With pain will give birth to children. The Septuagint reads, a snare has increased your sorrow and groaning. And that's exactly what happened. She was tricked, and it's causing her no end of grief. Okay? So the Hebrew here is misogynistic. It's twisting and saying, especially the second part I haven't got to yet, but This is not about labor pains as much. I mean, certainly that's a part of it. That's the literal part of it, pain in giving birth to children. But as even this footnote for the Hebrew explains, this is more inclusive than that and includes the emotional pain of all that encompasses pregnancy and childbirth and losing children and the pain of labor and all that stuff. That word pain is also being used later here in this passage for Adam's toil in working hard to grow his food. And so there's the Septuagint seems to fit the context better here, where it says that she has been tricked and it's going to cause her all this grief. Now, this also from the Hebrew goes on to even in their footnotes, they contradict it. It says the turning toward her husband and he will dominate you. They take that as meaning turning toward, wanting to control. And I don't know where they get that. All right. It doesn't say anywhere in here that she wants to control him. The footnote 48 here says the literal Hebrew is toward your husband will be your desire. The Septuagint word is apostrophe. Our word apostrophe is literally a transliteration of the Greek, and we use it to indicate a curved line that curves back on itself to indicate missing letters in English or possession in English. We get that word apostrophe from the fact that its meaning in Greek is to turn back, okay? And that's the word the Septuagint uses here. It says you will want to turn back to your husband, but when you do that, he will dominate you. So this is a prediction. This is not a command, it's a prediction. He's telling Eve, God is telling Eve, you're going to make a big mistake here. You're going to do it. And I'm telling you ahead of time, because she was not the one taken from the dirt, remember, and formed from the dust. And we're going to see in the language following that all the curse on Adam is all about the ground that he was taken from, okay? She was not taken from the ground. And yet he is going to be driven out, and she will choose to go with him. She could have stayed. And that promise of the seed of the woman would have literally been fulfilled right then and there, because there would have been no man there at all, a virgin birth. So, but she will choose, instead of staying there, to follow Adam out. And we're going to see that here right now. Verse 17, chapter 3. Now God turns to Adam. Because, this is where they say, because you obeyed your wife. No, the Hebrew, as they themselves say in their footnote, because you listened to your wife. You heard her. You were standing there when all this happened and she said those things. Because of that, and you ate from the tree, cursed is the ground thanks to you. In painful toil you will eat of it all the days of your life. It will produce thorns and thistles for you, but you will eat the grain of the field. By the sweat of your brow you will eat food until you return to the ground, for from it you were taken, for you are dust, and to dust you will return. Have you ever heard that at a graveside, dust to dust, and all that? That's where that comes from. Who was taken from the dust? Only the man. Only the man was taken from the dust. And by this point, the Hebrew is more specific because the split happened, and obviously, and so he's talking to Ish here. He's talking to the man who eventually starts calling him Adam, even though Adam was the term for all mankind at first. Now he's saying the one who was made from the dust. You're going to have to scratch the ground to make your food, to grow your food, and when you die, you're going to be put back into the ground because you were taken out of it. And this is why the Bible will say that all of creation was cursed. It's because of Adam, he was taken from the ground. Okay? And so this is why Eve would have to choose to follow him. She wouldn't have to choose to follow him. She would have to choose. And she would choose to follow him. And because of that, he would dominate her. And that's where all that started from. Now, his naming of Eve in verse 20 does not, once again, mean an authority. He was there first, that's all. And so he called her mother of all the living because everyone would come from her. And this is the exact argument what Paul would make in 1 Corinthians 11, where he says everyone comes from God. And every man is born of woman. So there's no hierarchy here. Even though woman came from man, ever since then, man comes from woman. So You know, all that talk of hierarchy is absolutely without any kind of basis in Scripture. So now we see the first animal sacrifice. By implication, God made garments from skin for Adam and Eve and clothed them to cover up and remind them. And this purpose of sacrifice was to remind people of their sin. Yeah, the innocent animal suffers, but Jesus would be the innocent one to come. So this is a prophecy also, the coming of the Messiah, the innocent dying for the guilty, or covering up their sin. That's what that's all about. And then in verse 22, God says, now that the man has become like one of us, knowing good and evil. And actually, of course, both of them knew because they both ate the fruit. But he must not be allowed to stretch out his hand and take from the tree of life and eat and live forever. Why didn't God want Adam to live forever? Because he knew good and evil. Okay? So he had to be driven out away from the tree of life. Because only by dying would his corrupt body be gotten rid of, and he would go back to spirit. So this is why the tree of the knowledge of good and evil had to be guarded. So he was expelled, and Eve went with him, and to work the ground from which he had been taken. And once he was driven out, God posted a sentinel angel to guard the way to the tree of life. Now, here's where we get back to the last thing I wanted to show here in Genesis, about Genesis 4:1, where the man had marital relations with his wife Eve, and she became pregnant and gave birth to Cain. Serpent is not Cain's father. End of the serpent seed theory. Then she said, I have created a man just as the Lord did. Okay? So she, even so, after being driven out and making the wrong choice, was thinking, okay, now this is my seed. This is how, this is the one that will rescue us from this corruption and death and everything. But of course, she was misunderstood, was mistaken. But that's the statement she made. She had created a man just as the Lord did. So take from that what you want. So anyway, there we have the account of how God created everything, and we looked a little bit at the dome or firmament or whatever you want to call it, and we looked at creation in all the other aspects, and that there was never meant to be this war between the sexes. There was never meant to be this hostility against women, and the fact that there was never meant to be death of animals or anything. At first, people were supposed to eat fruit. Then they ate vegetables, and we would see later, if we went to Genesis 11 and the account of the flood, that after the flood is when God gave animals as food for people. So because the flood made so many changes, and I don't have time to get into that today. But hopefully you can, I would recommend you looking at this Net's translation. I'll put all these links in the description. And here also is one that I don't remember if I mentioned about a discussion by Dr. Catherine Bushnell back in the 1900s, late 1800s, early 1900s, of her discussion of Eve's turning. So there we have it. I've shortened the thing from what I said this morning because, like I said, this is my second attempt to do this, and I went to a Hangout instead of just recording it at home because the audio kept cutting out and I lost all my visuals. So there's only, 2 people in the chat that I've seen. I might have missed some. So if anybody has a question, this is your big chance to ask. And I would encourage everybody to take advantage of these resources, because if you're going to talk about Genesis, you better know what you're talking about and not just surface skim. And I don't care how many translations you read it in. You got to sit and think about these things. Think about the context. Think about the culture and the languages and the dynamics of a situation, of the drama, if you will, of what was going on here. So things went wrong, they will be made right, but this is where it all started. And if anybody has any questions, feel free to ask. Thanks for coming, Victoria and Wade. yeah, there's a lot more going on here than you would typically hear, and a lot of bad teachings come out of a misinterpretation of Genesis, and especially the fall of man, and how we should be living. Because in the New Testament, Jesus said that he was, Jesus didn't say it, but Paul wrote that Jesus was the last Adam. He wrote that to the Romans in his most theological letter as opposed to a personal letter. Paul said that as the last Adam, Jesus came to undo what Adam did, and therefore any notions about how things were between Adam and Eve before then are laid to rest, because Jesus came to do much more than just pay for sins. He came to undo the damage. He came to make everything the way it was before sin entered the world. And that means no more physical death, no more hierarchy, except between God and man. And I would just, it would be great to hear anybody who would study these things try to justify, even, as I said, these people, this Nest translation. It's really hard to justify their translation sometimes by what they say in their own notes. So, but that's bias coming in, and there isn't a translation on the earth that isn't biased. But once again, thanks to all of you. There's 5 watching, it says, and there's between me and Victoria and Wade, there's 3 of us that I know of. So 2 other people are watching. Oh, there's Bobsta. I did not see you. I'm sorry. Let me look back here. I don't think I see anyone else. Welcome to you. There's Agave, a giant herd of reindeer killed by lightning today. Oh my goodness. And a church burning in Philadelphia. Philly. You came right at the end there, Agave. You're just gonna have to play it over, I guess. Oh, you were lurking? Okay. You sneaky guy, you. But if anybody has a question or you want on the panel, let me know. Although pretty soon I'm going to have to at least take a little break here. I just got a text that some relatives of mine might be stopping by in a little bit, so I can't stay too long. But I hope you found this enjoyable, if not informative, and that the audio didn't cut out. It didn't seem to. I was having all kinds of problems this morning trying to record it just on my computer. Thank you, Vic. Blessings to you too, and everybody else who came. And if there was anything else you want me to talk about in the chat, say it soon, or I will shut this down. But once again, I will try to put some more things in the description here. All these links of the tabs that I had up. So written chat can keep going, and I could answer things in the written chat, but I think I'm going to shut down the broadcast and take a little break, and then I'll come back and see what's going on in written chat, unless somebody has an objection. So say it now, or we will stop broadcast. Alrighty. See you guys later. Thanks for coming.